Most people know James Stewart as the wholesome face of Hollywood's golden age, the everyman, the good guy. What most people don't know is that the man who played George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life flew bombing missions over Nazi Germany while his crewmen were shot out of the sky around him. That he came home shattered in ways he never publicly admitted. That he lost his son to another war he couldn't stop. He spent decades refusing to talk about any of it. And when the truth finally came out, it was heavier than anyone had expected. This is the war record Hollywood never fully told you about. The star who actually enlisted. In 1941, James Stewart was one of the most famous men in America. He had just won the Academy Award for Best Actor for The Philadelphia Story. He had starred in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which had made him the embodiment of American decency on screen. He was 33 years old, box office gold, and at the absolute peak of the career that studios like MGM had spent years building around his particular combination of charm, vulnerability, and quiet authority. He was, by every conventional measure, the last person Hollywood wanted to see leave for a war. He left anyway. Stewart had already obtained his private pilot's license before the war, paying for flying lessons out of his own pocket because he was genuinely fascinated by aviation, not as a hobby, but as something he took seriously in the way he took most things seriously, which was to say, completely. When the United States began mobilizing after Pearl Harbor, he didn't wait to be drafted. He went to an Army Air Corps recruiting office and tried to enlist voluntarily. He was rejected. Not for any dramatic reason, he was underweight. At 6 feet 3 inches, he came in below the minimum weight requirement for induction. His response was methodical rather than dramatic. He went home, ate as much as he could for several weeks, and came back. The second time, he passed. In March 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, he was inducted as a private, the lowest rank in the United States Army. This is worth pausing on. James Stewart was a sitting Academy Award winner who enlisted as a private at a time when he could have pursued almost any alternative. He could have sought an exemption on occupational grounds. The entertainment industry was considered important to national morale, and many performers used that designation to avoid service. He could have sought a non-combat posting. He could have used his celebrity to obtain a comfortable assignment that looked like service without carrying its risks. He did none of those things. He wanted to fly combat missions, and he spent considerable effort working toward exactly that. MGM's Louis B. Mayer was furious. He reportedly pressured military contacts to keep Stewart in a non-combat role, arguing that Stewart's face was a national asset that couldn't be risked. Stewart found out about these efforts and worked around them, transferring between units, volunteering for positions that moved him closer to combat assignments, using the military bureaucracy with the same patient persistence he used for everything else. By 1943, he was in England with the 8th Air Force, assigned to the 445th Bombardment Group flying B-24 Liberators. He was 35 years old for a combat pilot by the standards of that war, and he was exactly where he had spent 2 years maneuvering to be. What he found there was nothing like the war movies he had appeared in. The 8th Air Force's bombing campaign over Europe in 1943 and 1944 was one of the most brutal, sustained military operations of the entire war. Casualty rates among bomber crews were staggering. On some missions, crews faced anti-aircraft fire so dense that pilots described it as being able to walk on it. German fighter interceptions were constant and devastating. Men who completed their required number of missions, 25 in the early part of the war, later raised to 35, were statistical anomalies. Most didn't make it. Stewart flew his first combat mission in December 1943. He would fly 19 more. What he saw over Germany. The missions James Stewart flew were not training exercises with acceptable risk margins. They were operations over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, targeting industrial and military sites deep inside Nazi Germany against an air defense system that had been specifically designed to make what the 8th Air Force was attempting as costly as possible. His early missions included targets over Bremen and Frankfurt cities with dense concentrations of anti-aircraft artillery and fighter interceptors stationed at multiple points along the approach routes. Bomber crews approaching these targets flew in formation because formation flying provided some mutual protection, but it also meant that when a plane went down, the crews in the surrounding aircraft watched it happen. They watched the aircraft fill with fire. They watched men bail out, some successfully, most not. They watched planes disintegrate. And then they held their own formation and continued toward the target because breaking formation made everyone more vulnerable. Stewart commanded the 703rd Bombardment Squadron and later became the operations officer for the 453rd Bombardment Group, which put him in a position of planning the missions that sent other men into the same conditions he was flying through himself. This is a specific kind of psychological weight that combat pilots talk about rarely and inadequately. The knowledge that the decisions you make at a briefing table will determine which of your men come back and which don't. Several of his missions stand out in the historical record. During a raid on Brunswick in February 1944, his formation came under sustained fighter attack. Multiple aircraft in his group were lost. Stewart brought his plane back, the losses he had witnessed and, as group operations officer, bore some planning responsibility for, were not abstractions. These were men he had briefed that morning, men whose faces he knew, men who were gone by the time he landed. He flew a mission over Berlin, one of the most dangerous targets in the entire European theater. At a time when the casualty rate on Berlin raids was high enough that crews assigned to them understood the statistical implications clearly. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for leading a formation through intense fighter opposition and completing the bombing run despite conditions that would have justified turning back. He received a second Distinguished Flying Cross for subsequent missions. He received the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. He received the French Croix de Guerre. These are not ceremonial awards. Each one corresponds to specific documented acts under fire. What is equally documented, though less discussed, is what all of it cost him. Stewart developed what he described, in the careful language of a man who didn't want to examine it too closely, as difficulty sleeping. He had recurring nightmares about missions. He carried a specific and persistent anxiety that people who knew him well, and very few people knew him well, recognized as something that didn't belong to the Jimmy Stewart who had gone to England in 1943. He rarely spoke about the missions. When asked directly, he changed the subject. In interviews across several decades of public life, he maintained an almost complete silence about the specific content of what he had experienced, deflecting with self-deprecating humor or brief generalities about duty and service. It was a silence that spoke clearly to anyone who knew what to listen for. The men who flew with him remembered him differently from the public did. To the public, he was Jimmy Stewart, the movie star who had served. To the men of the 453rd Bombardment Group, he was a commander who had flown the same missions he sent them on, who had never asked them to go somewhere he hadn't gone himself, and who had brought his aircraft back when others didn't. That distinction mattered. It still does. The PTSD he never named. James Stewart came home from the war in September 1945. He was 37 years old. He had been away for 4 years. He was one of the most decorated actors in American military history. And he was, by the account of people who saw him in those first months, visibly not the same person who had left. The Hollywood he returned to had moved on in the way that industries move on quickly, practically, with limited patience for anyone who couldn't keep up. His old contract with MGM had lapsed. His contemporaries had maintained their careers through the war years. The roles and momentum he had built before enlisting were not waiting for him. He had to rebuild, and he had to do it while managing an internal state that he had no vocabulary for and no institutional support to address. What we now recognize as PTSD presented in Stewart as a cluster of symptoms he described only in fragments across many years of occasional candor. The nightmares were the most documented. He admitted to them in several interviews, always briefly, always in the past tense, as if they had resolved themselves. The persistent anxiety was described by his wife Gloria, whom he married in 1949, as something she recognized in him throughout their marriage, a background hum of tension that never fully quieted, that spiked in response to certain sounds or situations that occasionally surfaced in the middle of the night. He was afraid of flying. The man who had spent years pursuing combat aviation, who had logged hundreds of hours in B-24s over some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, developed a fear of flying that required considerable effort to manage for the rest of his life. He continued to fly because he refused to surrender to it. But the ease and pleasure he had found in aviation before the war never fully returned. His film career, when it restarted, took a noticeably darker turn. The roles that defined his post-war career were not the wholesome idealists of the 1930s. Alfred Hitchcock cast him in Rear Window and Vertigo films, built on obsession, voyeurism, psychological instability, and a particular kind of male anxiety that critics have spent decades analyzing. Anthony Mann cast him in a series of westerns that were brutal and morally complicated by the standards of 1950s genre cinema, featuring a version of Stewart that was driven, angry, and psychologically scarred in ways the pre-war Jimmy Stewart never was. Whether this was a conscious artistic choice or something more instinctive, whether Stewart was drawn to these roles because they gave form to something he was carrying, is not something he ever addressed directly. But the pattern is consistent and too pronounced to be coincidental. His director and longtime collaborator, Frank Capra, noticed the change and found it difficult to work around. Their post-war collaboration, which had produced some of the most celebrated American films of the 1930s, never fully rekindled. It's a Wonderful Life, released in 1946 and now considered one of the greatest American films ever made, was considered a commercial disappointment at the time of its release. The darkness at the center of that film, the portrait of a man who has lost his sense of purpose and stands on a bridge contemplating whether his life was worth living, came from somewhere. Stewart inhabited it in a way that went beyond craft. Nobody asked him where it came from. He wouldn't have answered if they had. The conflicts, the feuds, and the political fault lines. James Stewart was not a man who made enemies easily or often. His public reputation for decency was not entirely unfounded. People who worked with him across 5 decades of film consistently described a man who was considerate, professional, and genuine in his interactions. He was not Hollywood's idea of a difficult star, but he had conflicts. Some of them were quiet and slow-burning. Some of them drew public attention, and some of them revealed the specific fault lines running through his life in ways that the carefully managed public image couldn't fully conceal. His most famous personal conflict was with his closest friend. Henry Fonda and James Stewart had been friends since the 1930s, when they were both young actors sharing a house in Hollywood, building careers in parallel, and spending evenings building model airplanes together, a hobby they shared with genuine enthusiasm. Their friendship was one of Hollywood's most documented close male bonds, the kind that produced stories people told for decades about the easy comfort of two people who understood each other completely. Politics ended it, or very nearly did. Stewart was a committed conservative Republican, not casually or moderately, but deeply, ideologically, and with the conviction of a man who believed in it the way he believed in most things, which was completely. He was a supporter and personal friend of Barry Goldwater, the Arizona senator whose 1964 presidential campaign represented the most right-wing major party candidacy in modern American history at that point. He campaigned for Goldwater. He appeared at fundraisers. He was not quiet about it. Fonda was a liberal Democrat, equally committed, equally unambiguous. His political views had moved leftward across his career and his personal life, culminating in positions on Vietnam and civil rights that put him at the opposite end of the spectrum from Stewart in ways that were not bridgeable through affection alone. Their arguments became legendary among people who witnessed them. Fonda's daughter Jane later described the political dinners between the two men as events that could turn volcanic with very little provocation. At some point, the specific timing is disputed. The arguments grew severe enough that the friendship effectively went cold. The two men who had spent evenings building model airplanes together stopped spending evenings together at all. They eventually reconciled, at least partially, in their later years. Both men were old enough by then to value the friendship more than the argument. But the easy closeness of their earlier decades never fully returned, and the political division that created the distance was real and documented by multiple people who knew both of them. His relationship with Alfred Hitchcock followed a different but equally painful arc. Hitchcock had directed Stewart in 4 films: Rope, Rear Window, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and Vertigo, producing work that many critics consider among the finest of both men's careers. The collaboration seemed fixed, the working relationship creatively productive and personally respectful. Then, Hitchcock dropped him. When Hitchcock began developing North by Northwest, he cast Cary Grant instead of Stewart, reportedly because he felt Stewart was too old for the role and that audiences would find him less credible as an action lead. Stewart found out about the casting through the industry grapevine, rather than from Hitchcock directly. He was hurt by both the decision and the manner of it, that a director he had trusted and worked with closely had moved on without the courtesy of a direct conversation. He never worked with Hitchcock again. He rarely addressed the subject publicly, which was consistent with how he handled most personal wounds by not addressing them at all. John Wayne represented a different kind of friction, less personal, more cultural, but felt throughout Hollywood for years. Wayne, 2 years younger than Stewart, had not served in World War II despite being of eligible age. The reasons he gave varied across different accounts: a football injury, studio pressure, family obligations. Whatever the reason, Wayne spent the war years making westerns in Hollywood while Stewart flew combat missions over Germany. Wayne subsequently became one of the most vocal proponents of American military patriotism in Hollywood, building a public persona entirely around masculine toughness and military virtue. Stewart, who had actually done the thing Wayne was performing, never sought that comparison publicly. But people who knew him noted a particular quality to his silence when Wayne's name came up in certain contexts. He never attacked Wayne. He never contrasted explicitly. He didn't need to. The son he lost, and the silence he kept. In August 1969, Ronald McLean Stewart was killed in Vietnam. Ronald was James Stewart's stepson, the child of Gloria Stewart from her previous marriage, adopted by Stewart when he married her in 1949, and raised as his own with the same quiet thoroughness that characterized everything Stewart committed himself to. Ronald was a Marine. He was 24 years old when he died in combat in Quang Tri Province. Stewart did not speak publicly about Ronald's death in any meaningful way for years. The loss was enormous. Friends and colleagues described it as the blow that aged him most visibly, the one that landed in a place that his composure couldn't fully protect. He had survived his own war, had carried the weight of the men he had flown with and the men who hadn't come back, and had somehow integrated all of it into a functional life. Ronald's death landed differently. This was his son. In a different war, for reasons that were by 1969 far more contested than the reasons Stewart had flown over Germany in 1944. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart in ways that made his own war service complicated to think about. The people marching against Vietnam were not, for the most part, against the soldiers. But the cultural atmosphere of 1969 made it difficult for a man with Stewart's political convictions and military history to grieve publicly without that grief becoming political. So he kept it private, the way he kept everything private. His refusal to speak about his wartime experiences, which had been consistent since 1945, deepened after Ronald's death. He had never talked about Germany. He certainly wasn't going to talk about Vietnam. The silence that some journalists had interpreted as modesty and others as repression became, after 1969, something that felt more like self-protection. There was simply too much in that territory to open any of it up without opening all of it. He gave one interview in the early 1980s, one of the very few in which he addressed the war directly. in which he said that he didn't talk about his combat experience because he didn't think it was something that should be talked about. He said that the men who had died deserved more than to become material for interviews. He said that some things were private, not because they were shameful, but because they were too significant to reduce to the kind of answer that interviews required. It was the most honest thing he said publicly about any of it. He stayed in the Air Force Reserve after World War II, eventually reaching the rank of Brigadier General in 1959, the highest military rank ever achieved by an American entertainer. The promotion required an act of Congress because of regulations governing reserve promotions, and several members of Congress moved to make it happen because his service record genuinely merited it. He took the rank seriously. He continued attending reserve functions and maintaining his military connections long after it would have been easy to let the association become purely ceremonial. He died on July 2, 1997, at the age of 89. Gloria had died 2 years earlier in 1994, and people who saw him in his final years described a man who had lost the anchor that had held him since 1949. He had outlived most of the men he had flown with. He had outlived his son. He had outlived most of the people who knew what the silence actually contained. His medals are displayed at the James Stewart Museum in Indiana, Pennsylvania, his hometown. They include the Distinguished Flying Cross with oak leaf cluster, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, the American Campaign Medal, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 6 battle stars, and the French Croix de Guerre with palm. Each one represents something specific that happened in a specific place at a specific moment, involving specific people, most of whom are no longer alive to describe it. He never described it either, which means the fullest account of what James Stewart actually experienced between 1943 and 1945 went with him. What remains is the record, the mission logs, the commendations, the casualty lists from the groups he commanded, the testimony of men who flew alongside him and came home. Taken together, they describe a war record that was not just real, but genuinely extraordinary, more dangerous, more sustained, and more costly than the version that appears in most accounts of his life. He didn't want credit for it. He didn't want pity for what it cost. He wanted it to belong to the men who hadn't come back, which is exactly the kind of thing a person says when they are carrying guilt that has no clean resolution. The wholesome face of American cinema flew 20 combat missions over Nazi Germany. He watched his crews die. He planned missions that sent men to their deaths. He came home and made movies about men in crisis. He lost his son to a different war in a different decade. And he spent 50 years not talking about any of it. That is not the story most people know. It is the true one. The performance that was never a performance. There is a question that film historians and people who study James Stewart's career keep circling back to without ever fully answering it. Was the psychological depth that defined his greatest performances something he learned as a craftsman? Or was it something he already had, something the war had deposited in him, whether he wanted it or not, that he was simply putting on screen? The timing is difficult to dismiss. Before the war, Stewart was extraordinary but recognizable within a specific type. The earnest idealist, the good-hearted everyman fighting against corruption or circumstance with an innocence that felt genuine because it largely was. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The Philadelphia Story, You Can't Take It With You. These are brilliant performances, but they are performances of a man who still believes, fundamentally, that the world makes sense and that goodness is rewarded. After the war, that version of Stewart effectively ceased to exist. The roles he chose and the way he inhabited them shifted in a direction that can only be described as haunted. In Anthony Mann's westerns, Winchester 73, Bend of the River, The Naked Spur, The Man from Laramie, Stewart played men defined not by innocence, but by damage. Men with histories they couldn't escape, driven by obsession, capable of violence that went beyond what the story required, operating in a moral landscape where right and wrong were negotiable and survival was the only reliable currency. These were not the roles a pre-war Jimmy Stewart would have been drawn to. They fit the post-war one perfectly. Hitchcock understood something about Stewart that the studios hadn't fully grasped yet. In Vertigo, widely considered now one of the greatest films ever made, Stewart played Scotty Ferguson, a man destroyed by obsession, guilt, and an inability to accept loss. The performance requires the audience to stay with a protagonist who is not sympathetic in any conventional sense, who does genuinely disturbing things, who is in some fundamental way broken beyond repair. Stewart doesn't just play it. He inhabits it from somewhere real. He received no Academy Award nomination for Vertigo. Critics at the time were uncertain about the film. It was only in later years, then decades later, that people began to understand what they had been watching. A man who had seen what Stewart had seen, carrying what Stewart was carrying, being directed by someone who understood exactly which wound to press. Despite their political estrangement, once said something about Stewart in an interview that has been quoted repeatedly because it captures something precise. He said that Jimmy had always been a good actor, but that something happened to him that made him a great one. Fonda didn't specify what that something was. He didn't need to. There is also the specific and documented episode of It's a Wonderful Life's troubled production. Frank Capra wanted to work with Stewart because he believed Stewart could access something genuine in the role of George Bailey, a man who has spent his entire life sacrificing his own ambitions for others, and who has reached a point of such complete desolation that he concludes the people around him would be better off if he had never been born. The character stands on a bridge in the cold and considers not surviving the night. Audiences and critics who watch Stewart in that scene, even those who found the film sentimental or manipulative in other ways, consistently note that the breakdown sequence, the desperate prayer, the moment of total collapse, lands with a weight that goes beyond technical performance. It lands because it came from somewhere. Stewart never discussed what he drew on for those moments. He deflected questions about his acting process the same way he deflected questions about his war service with humor, with brevity, with a redirection so smooth that interviewers often didn't notice they hadn't received an answer. In the darkness of the Westerns, in the obsession with the Hitchcock films, in the collapse at the center of Capra's Christmas movie that America watches every year without fully recognizing what it's watching, a man who has been to the edge and come back, performed by a man who had actually been there. He never claimed any of this. He would have denied it if pressed. That denial was itself the performance of the last one, maintained across 50 years of interviews and public appearances, of a man who had decided that what he had survived was his to keep and nobody else's to examine. James Stewart flew 20 combat missions over Nazi Germany, lost his son to Vietnam, and spent 50 years saying nothing about any of it. He put it all on screen instead. You just didn't know you were watching it. Like and subscribe. The next story is just as intriguing.